They found her 3 days later, face down, lifeless, hidden where no one should have had to look. Beverly Wivel was 23 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, a future full of possibilities, plans for the weekend, maybe a phone call she was supposed to make, a friend she was supposed to meet. None of that mattered anymore, because on a September night in 1989, someone decided Beverly didn't deserve to see another sunrise. Someone took everything from her, and then they vanished. No arrests, no charges, no justice. Just a grieving family, a terrified community, and a case that would sit untouched for over 3 decades. 36 years. That's how long Beverly's killer walked free. 36 years of living a normal life while her family lived in agony. 36 years of birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings, all while Beverly's parents waited for answers that never came. They grew old, they got sick, and eventually they died never knowing who murdered their daughter. The case went cold, the evidence gathered dust, detectives moved on, the world forgot. But the truth? The truth was waiting, because in February 2025, everything changed. A breakthrough that seemed impossible became reality. DNA technology that didn't exist in 1989 reached back through time and pointed directly at a killer who thought he was untouchable. A man in his 60s, living quietly, blending in, probably convinced he'd gotten away with it. He hadn't. This is the story of Beverly Wivel and the 36-year journey to bring her killer to justice. It's a story about a family's unimaginable pain, a community's unhealed wound, and the relentless march of science that refuses to let murderers hide in the shadows forever. We're going back to Washington County, Michigan, in 1989. Back to a time when forensic technology was primitive, when DNA databases didn't exist, and when a young woman's life was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. We'll walk through the desperate search, the heartbreaking discovery, and the investigation that hit wall after wall. We'll sit with a family as they endured decades of silence, watching other cases get solved while theirs remained frozen in time. And we'll witness the moment when modern science finally cracked a case that everyone thought was unsolvable. This isn't just another true crime story. This is proof that no matter how much time passes, justice can still find its way home. So if you're ready to dive into one of the most stunning cold case breakthroughs in recent history, stick with me, because what happened to Beverly Wivel in 1989 is only half the story. The other half? That took 36 years to unfold. But before we get into it, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how far this community reaches. Whether you're watching from New York, Texas, across the ocean, or somewhere in between, let me know you're here. And if you're new to Easy Case, welcome. This is where we tell real stories about real people, stories that matter, stories that deserve to be heard. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and turn on notifications, because we've got more cases coming your way that'll keep you up at night. All right, let's do this. Let's go back to September 1989. Back to Washington County, Michigan. Back to a young woman who had no idea that one ordinary evening would be her last. Back to the night Beverly Wivel disappeared. And back to the moment her family's nightmare began. This is her story. And after 36 years of silence, it's finally time the world heard every single detail. September 1989. Washington County, Michigan. If you weren't from there, you probably didn't know much about it. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. No skyscrapers, no bustling downtown with flashing lights and endless traffic. Just a quiet stretch of middle America where people knew their neighbors, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, and where you could leave your front door unlocked without a second thought. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than the local newspaper could print it, where Friday night football games packed the stands and Sunday mornings meant church bells ringing across town. Washington County wasn't flashy. It wasn't trying to be. It was home, simple, safe. Or at least, that's what people believed. Beverly Wivel was 23 years old that September. 23 and full of life in the way young people are when the world still feels wide open. She had that energy, the kind that made people smile when she walked into a room. Friends described her as warm, genuine, the type of person who remembered your birthday, who asked how your day was and actually meant it. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention, but somehow, she always drew people in. Beverly had grown up in Washington County. She knew these streets like the back of her hand. She'd gone to school here, made lifelong friends here, built memories on every corner. This was her town, her people, her life, and she was building something for herself. She wasn't just drifting through her 20s with no direction. She had plans, goals, a vision for what came next. She worked locally. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her a sense of independence. She was proud of that, proud that she could stand on her own 2 feet. She wasn't waiting around for life to happen to her, she was making it happen. She talked about the future the way young people do when they still believe anything is possible. Maybe she'd move somewhere bigger one day. Maybe she'd stay close to home. Maybe she'd fall in love, start a family, build the kind of life her parents had built. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had time, or so she thought. Beverly was close with her family, really close. The kind of close where you didn't just show up for holidays, you showed up on random Tuesdays just because. Her parents adored her. She was their daughter, their pride, their joy. They'd raised her to be kind, to be strong, to be independent, and she was all of those things. Her siblings looked up to her. Her friends leaned on her. She was the person people called when they needed advice, when they needed a laugh, when they just needed someone to listen. She had a routine. Most people do. Wake up, go to work, come home, make plans with friends, watch TV, talk on the phone for hours about nothing and everything. It was ordinary, beautifully, wonderfully ordinary. And that's what made what happened next so unthinkable. Because in September 1989, Beverly's ordinary life collided with something evil. It started like any other evening. The sun was setting earlier now. Fall was creeping in. The air had that crisp edge to it, the kind that made you reach for a jacket on your way out the door. Beverly had plans that night. Nothing major, nothing that would raise any red flags. Just a regular evening in a regular town. She told her family she'd be back later. She smiled. She walked out the door. And that was the last time they saw her alive. No one thought anything of it at first. Why would they? Beverly was an adult. She had her own life. She came and went as she pleased. There was no reason to worry. Not yet. But as the hours ticked by, something started to feel off. Beverly wasn't the type to just disappear. She wasn't reckless. She didn't blow off plans without calling. She didn't leave people hanging. So when she didn't come home that night, her family felt it. That creeping unease that starts in your gut and spreads like ice through your veins. They tried to stay calm. Maybe she stayed over at a friend's house. Maybe she lost track of time. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation and they were worrying over nothing. But deep down, they knew. Something was wrong. Washington County in the late 80s wasn't the kind of place where young women just vanished. Sure, crime existed. Every town has its problems. But this felt different. This felt like something that happened in other places. In big cities. In dark alleys far away from here. Not in Washington County. Not to someone like Beverly. Her friends were the same way. Confused, concerned, trying to piece together the last time they'd seen her, the last conversation they'd had. Everyone was retracing steps, making phone calls, asking questions. Where did she go? Who was she with? Did anyone see anything? Hear anything? But the answers weren't coming fast enough. Beverly's parents didn't sleep that night. How could they? Their daughter was out there somewhere, and they had no idea where. They kept expecting the phone to ring, kept expecting her to walk through the door with some wild story about car trouble or a miscommunication. They kept expecting everything to be okay. It wasn't. Because 3 days later, the call finally came. But it wasn't the call they'd been praying for. It wasn't Beverly saying she was fine, that she was sorry for worrying them, that everything was just a big misunderstanding. It was the police. And the words they heard shattered their world into a million pieces. Beverly had been found, but she wasn't coming home. Not the way they'd hoped, not the way anyone hopes. She was dead. Murdered. The details were sparse at first. The kind of sparse that leaves your mind racing, filling in the blanks with images you can't unsee. All they knew was that their daughter, their bright, beautiful, 23-year-old daughter, had been killed. Someone had taken her life. Someone had stolen her future. And just like that, everything changed. Washington County wasn't safe anymore. It wasn't the quiet, friendly town where nothing bad ever happened. It was the place where Beverly Wivel was murdered, and no one knew who did it. Her family was drowning in grief, the kind of grief that doesn't have words, the kind that sits on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. They couldn't process it, couldn't make sense of it. How do you go from waiting for your daughter to come home to planning her funeral? How do you accept that the last time you saw her smile was the last time, period? Her friends were devastated. Her co-workers were in shock. The whole community felt it. People locked their doors for the first time in years. Parents held their kids a little tighter. Everyone was looking over their shoulders, wondering who could have done this, wondering if the killer was someone they knew, someone they passed on the street, someone sitting in the pew behind them at church. Because that's the thing about small towns. When something like this happens, the fear doesn't just touch one family, it touches everyone. It changes the way people see their neighbors. It plants seeds of suspicion and paranoia that take root and grow. Beverly Wivel wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to fall in love, to travel, to laugh until her sides hurt, to make mistakes and learn from them. She deserved all the ordinary, beautiful moments that make up a life. But someone took that from her, and in September 1989, as her family buried her and the community mourned, one question echoed louder than anything else. Who did this? The first night Beverly didn't come home. Her mother couldn't sleep. She kept getting up, walking to the window, pulling back the curtain, hoping to see headlights turning into the driveway. Every car that passed sent her heart racing. Every sound made her think maybe, just maybe, that was Beverly coming through the door with some explanation that would make all this worry seem silly. But the driveway stayed empty. The door stayed closed. And as the hours crawled by, that worry turned into something heavier, something darker. By morning, the Wivel family knew this wasn't normal. Beverly always called. Always. If she was staying somewhere overnight, she let them know. If plans changed, she checked in. That was just who she was. Considerate, responsible, the kind of daughter who didn't make her parents worry. So, when the sun came up and there was still no word, her father picked up the phone and started calling. Friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen her or talked to her, anyone who might know where she was. Nothing. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. That's when the panic really set in. Her mother was pacing now, hands shaking, mind racing through every possible scenario. Maybe she got into an accident. Maybe she's in a hospital somewhere and can't call. Maybe her car broke down in the middle of nowhere and she's stranded. Maybe she's hurt. Maybe she's scared. Maybe she needs help and we're just sitting here doing nothing. Her father called the police, tried to file a missing person report. But here's the thing about missing adults. In 1989, law enforcement didn't always jump into action right away. Beverly was 23, an adult. She had every right to go wherever she wanted without checking in. Maybe she just needed space. Maybe she took off for a few days. Maybe she'd show up on her own. But her parents knew better. They knew their daughter. And they knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. So they didn't wait. They started searching themselves, driving through town, checking places Beverly might have gone, asking neighbors if they'd seen anything, knocking on doors, retracing her steps from the night before, trying to piece together where she'd been, who she'd been with, what could have possibly happened. Word spread fast. In a town like Washington County, news traveled at lightning speed. By the second day, everyone knew Beverly Wivel was missing, and people started showing up to help. Friends gathered at the Wivel house, organizing search parties. They divided up the area into grids, assigned teams to cover every street, every park, every empty lot. They printed flyers with Beverly's picture on them, her smiling face staring out from hundreds of pieces of paper that would soon be taped to every storefront, telephone pole, and bulletin board in town. Missing. Beverly Wivel. 23 years old. Last seen September. Date. If you have any information, please call. Her mother couldn't look at those flyers without breaking down. Seeing her daughter's face like that reduced to a desperate plea for information, it was unbearable. But she pushed through. Because what else could she do? Sit at home and wait? No. She had to do something. Anything. The community rallied in a way that only small towns can. People who barely knew the Wivels showed up to search. Local businesses closed early so employees could join the effort. Churches organized prayer vigils. The high school let students out early to help distribute flyers. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to believe that if they just looked hard enough, they'd find her, safe, alive. The local news picked up the story. Beverly's face appeared on television screens across the region. Reporters stood outside the Wivel home, asking for interviews, asking for any details that might help. Her father spoke to the cameras, voice cracking, begging anyone with information to come forward. "If you've seen her, please call. If you know anything at all, please help us bring our daughter home." Her mother couldn't do the interviews. She could barely hold herself together. Every time someone asked her a question, the words got stuck in her throat. How do you describe the terror of not knowing where your child is? How do you put into words the feeling of helplessness that swallows you whole? The search parties went out every day, morning, afternoon, evening. Volunteers combed through wooded areas, checked abandoned buildings, walked along roadsides. They called her name until their voices went hoarse. They looked in places no one wanted to look, hoping they wouldn't find what they feared most, but hoping they'd find something. Anything. Because not knowing was its own kind of torture. The police were involved now too. Detectives started asking questions. When did you last see Beverly? What was she wearing? Did she seem upset? Was she meeting someone? Did she have any enemies? Any problems? Anything out of the ordinary? Her family answered every question, even though most of them felt pointless. No, Beverly didn't have enemies. No, she wasn't in trouble. No, there was nothing out of the ordinary. She was just living her life. And now, she was gone. Detectives interviewed her friends, her co-workers, people who'd seen her that day. They were building a timeline, trying to figure out her last known movements, where she went, who she talked to, what happened in those final hours before she vanished. But leads were thin. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard anything unusual. It was like Beverly had just disappeared into thin air. And with every passing hour, the dread grew heavier. Because everyone knew what the statistics said. The first 48 hours are critical. After that, the chances of finding a missing person alive dropped dramatically, and they were already past that window. Her mother refused to accept it. She kept telling herself that Beverly was out there somewhere, waiting to be found, that any minute now, the phone would ring with good news, that this nightmare would end and her daughter would come home. But deep down, in the place she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew. She felt it, the kind of knowing that sits in your bones and won't let go. Something terrible had happened. By the third day, the search parties were exhausted. Faces were drawn, eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep. But no one wanted to stop. Stopping felt like giving up, and no one was ready to give up on Beverly. Then the call came. A body had been found. The words hit like a freight train. Her family didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that the search was over. Not like this, not this way. But the police needed someone to identify the body. And as much as they wanted to hold on to hope, as much as they wanted to believe it was someone else, they knew. It was Beverly, their daughter, their bright, beautiful, 23-year-old daughter. The girl who smiled easily and loved deeply and had her whole life ahead of her. She was gone. And just like that, the search for Beverly Wivel ended. But the search for her killer? That was just beginning. They found her in a place no one should have had to look. A place that would forever be marked by what happened there. The kind of place that people would avoid from that day forward, unable to shake the knowledge of what it held. Beverly's body was discovered 3 days after she disappeared. 3 days of desperate searching. 3 days of hope, clinging by a thread. 3 days of her family praying for a miracle. But there would be no miracle. The details of the discovery were kept quiet at first. Law enforcement didn't release everything to the public. They never do in cases like this. But word got out anyway. It always does. Whispers spread through Washington County like wildfire. Hushed conversations in grocery store aisles. Rumors passed between neighbors over backyard fences. Everyone wanted to know what happened. Everyone was trying to piece together the horror of it. What they did know was enough to turn stomachs and break hearts. Beverly had been murdered. There was no question about that. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragic misunderstanding. Someone had deliberately taken her life. Someone had looked at this young woman full of dreams and potential and decided she didn't deserve to keep breathing. The violence of it shook people to their core. This wasn't just a death. This was an act of brutality, an act of rage, an act that spoke to something dark and twisted lurking in their community. For Beverly's family, the discovery was the moment hope died and horror took its place. They'd spent 3 days clinging to the possibility that she was still out there, still alive, maybe hurt, maybe scared, but alive, findable, savable. Now that possibility was gone, ripped away in the cruelest way imaginable. Her mother collapsed when they told her, just crumpled to the floor like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. The sound that came out of her wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was something primal, something that came from a place deeper than words. The sound of a mother's heart shattering into a million pieces. Her father went silent, completely silent. He just stood there, staring at nothing, trying to process information his brain refused to accept. His daughter was dead, murdered, gone forever. How do you make sense of that? How do you move forward from that? The siblings were devastated. They'd lost their sister, the person they'd grown up with, the person who was supposed to be at family dinners and holiday gatherings for decades to come, the person who was supposed to grow old alongside them. Now there was just an empty space where she used to be, a space that would never be filled. The Wivel home became a place of unbearable grief. Friends and family members streamed in, bringing casseroles and condolences, trying to offer comfort where none could be found. What do you say to parents who've just lost their child to murder? What words could possibly ease that kind of pain? There are no words, there's just presence, just showing up and sitting in the grief with them because that's all anyone can do. Outside the Wivel home, Washington County was reeling. The news hit the community like a bomb. People who'd been holding out hope that Beverly would be found safe were now confronted with the brutal reality. She wasn't coming home. She'd been killed, and her killer was still out there. That last part terrified people, because if someone could do this to Beverly, sweet, kind, harmless Beverly, then who was safe? If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Suddenly, Washington County didn't feel like the safe, sleepy town everyone thought it was. It felt dangerous, unpredictable, like there was a monster hiding among them. Parents started keeping their kids closer. Women stopped going out alone at night. People who used to leave their doors unlocked started bolting them shut. The sense of security that had defined this community for generations evaporated overnight. And the questions wouldn't stop. Who did this? Why? Was it someone from town? A stranger passing through? Someone Beverly knew? Someone she trusted? The not knowing was almost as terrifying as the knowing. Local news coverage exploded. What had been a missing person case was now a murder investigation. Reporters descended on Washington County, interviewing anyone who would talk. Beverly's face was everywhere. On television, in newspapers, on flyers that still hung around town, now serving as memorials instead of calls for help. The police were working around the clock. Detectives were interviewing everyone who'd had contact with Beverly in the days leading up to her death. They were processing the scene where her body was found, collecting evidence, looking for anything that might point them toward a suspect. But they were tight-lipped about what they'd found. They had to be. In a murder investigation, you don't show your cards too early. You don't give the killer information that might help them cover their tracks. Still, people wanted answers, needed answers. The community was demanding justice for Beverly, demanding that whoever did this be caught and punished. But justice doesn't move as fast as grief, and while detectives worked the case, Beverly's family had to plan a funeral. It was held on a grey, overcast day that felt fitting for the occasion. The church was packed, standing room only. Hundreds of people showed up to pay their respects, to say goodbye to a young woman who should have had decades of life ahead of her. Her mother could barely stand. She was held up by family members on either side, her face pale and drawn, her eyes empty. She stared at the casket at the box that held her daughter's body, and it didn't feel real. None of this felt real. The service was heartbreaking. Friends spoke about Beverly's kindness, her laughter, her warmth. They shared memories that made people smile through their tears. But every story was tinged with the tragedy of what had been stolen. Every memory was a reminder of all the moments that would never happen now. Her father gave a eulogy. He stood at the front of the church, hands gripping the podium to keep them from shaking, and he spoke about his daughter, about how much she meant to him, about how proud he was of the woman she'd become, about how unfair it was that her life had been cut short, and then he made a vow. "We will find who did this," he said, voice breaking but firm. "We will not rest until Beverly has justice. Whoever took her from us will be held accountable. I promise you that." The church was silent, except for the sound of people crying. It was a promise made in grief and rage and desperation, a promise that felt impossible in that moment, because how do you find a killer when you have no idea who they are? How do you deliver justice when the trail is already going cold? But it was a promise the Wivel family would hold on to for the next 36 years, because they had to believe that justice was possible. They had to believe that the person who murdered their daughter wouldn't get away with it forever. They had to believe that one day, somehow, the truth would come out. Even if it took decades, even if it took a lifetime, Beverly deserved that much. The investigation into Beverly Wivel's murder began the moment her body was discovered. Washington County didn't see many homicides. This wasn't Detroit or Chicago. This was a small community where violent crime was rare. So when a murder happened, especially one this brutal, every available resource was thrown at it. Lead detectives were assigned within hours, seasoned investigators who'd worked their share of cases, but nothing quite like this. They knew the pressure was on. The community was terrified. The family was devastated. And somewhere out there, a killer was walking free. They started at the scene where Beverly's body was found. Crime scene tape went up. Photographers documented everything, every angle, every detail. Evidence technicians combed through the area with meticulous care, bagging anything that might be relevant. Clothing fibers, cigarette butts, tire tracks, footprints, anything that didn't belong. It was painstaking work. The kind of work that requires patience and precision, because one missed detail could mean the difference between solving a case and letting a murderer slip through your fingers. They collected samples from Beverly's body, swabs for biological evidence, scrapings from under her fingernails in case she'd fought back and gotten DNA from her attacker. They photographed injuries, documented everything that might tell the story of what happened to her in those final moments. But here's the thing about 1989 forensic science wasn't what it is today. DNA testing existed, but it was new, expensive, time-consuming, and there was no national database to compare samples against. You couldn't just run a profile through a system and get a match. If you had a suspect, you could test their DNA against evidence from the scene, but without a suspect, that DNA evidence just sat there, waiting. Still, detectives did what they could with the tools they had. They processed the scene, they collected evidence, and then they started talking to people. Lots of people. They interviewed Beverly's family first. Not because they were suspects, though in murder investigations, you always look at the people closest to the victim, but because they needed to understand who Beverly was, what her life looked like, who she spent time with, whether she'd mentioned anything unusual in the days before she disappeared. Her parents were barely holding it together, but they answered every question, told detectives everything they could think of. Beverly didn't have enemies. She wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She wasn't seeing anyone who raised red flags. She was just a normal 23-year-old living a normal life. Detectives moved on to her friends, sat down with each one, asking the same questions. When did you last see Beverly? How did she seem? Did she mention meeting anyone? Going anywhere? Was she worried about anything? Scared of anyone? The answers were all variations of the same thing. Beverly seemed fine, happy, normal. No one noticed anything off. No one saw any warning signs. They interviewed co-workers, people who'd seen her at work in the days leading up to her death. Again, nothing stood out. Beverly showed up on time, did her job, chatted with colleagues. Everything was routine. Detectives went door to door in Beverly's neighborhood, knocked on every house within a several-block radius. Did you see anything unusual that night? Hear anything? Notice any strange cars? Any unfamiliar people? Most people had nothing to offer. They'd been home, hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. A few mentioned seeing Beverly leave that evening, but no one saw where she went or who she might have been meeting. The detectives were building a timeline, piecing together Beverly's final hours. She'd left home that evening around a certain time. She'd been heading somewhere, though where exactly, no one seemed to know for sure. And then, at some point between leaving home and when her body was discovered, someone had killed her. But the gap between those 2 points was frustratingly wide. Too many unknowns, too many missing pieces. They retraced her likely routes, drove the roads she might have taken, stopped at places she might have gone, gas stations, convenience stores, anywhere she might have been seen. They showed her picture around, asked if anyone remembered seeing her that night. A few people thought maybe they had, but memories are tricky, especially when you're trying to recall one face among dozens you might have seen that day. None of the potential sightings led anywhere concrete. Detectives also started looking at known offenders in the area, sex offenders, people with violent criminal histories, anyone who might fit the profile of someone capable of this kind of crime. They brought people in for questioning, asked for alibis, tried to eliminate possibilities. And here's where things get interesting and frustrating. Suspects did emerge. People whose names came up more than once. People who knew Beverly or had been in the area around the time she disappeared. People whose behavior or background raised questions. Detectives zeroed in on these individuals, conducted interviews, pressed for details, looked for inconsistencies in their stories. But here's the problem. Suspicion isn't proof. You can think someone did it. You can feel it in your gut. But unless you have evidence, solid, concrete, courtroom-ready evidence, you can't make an arrest. You can't charge someone with murder based on a hunch. And in 1989, the evidence just wasn't there. They had biological samples from the scene, but without a DNA database, those samples couldn't point them toward a suspect. They could only confirm or rule out someone once they already had them in custody. They had witness statements, but nothing definitive. No one who'd seen Beverly with her killer, no one who could place a specific person at the scene. They had theories, possibilities, persons of interest, but they didn't have enough. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a second. What time is it where you are right now? Seriously, drop it in the comments. I'm curious how many of you are watching this late at night, unable to sleep because you're hooked on this case. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this story ends. All right, back to 1989. Detectives were hitting walls. Every lead they chased seemed to fizzle out. Every promising tip led nowhere. The frustration was mounting, not just for law enforcement, but for Beverly's family and the entire community. People wanted answers. They wanted someone arrested. They wanted to feel safe again. But the case was stalling. Weeks turned into months. The initial flood of tips and leads slowed to a trickle. The media attention started to fade. Other stories took over the news cycle, and while detectives were still working the case, still following up on anything that came in, the momentum was gone. The limitations of 1980 seconds technology were becoming painfully clear. If this case had happened 20 years later, things might have been different. DNA databases would have been established. Surveillance cameras would have been everywhere. Cell phone records could have tracked movements. Digital footprints could have been traced. But in 1989, none of that existed. Detectives were working with what they had, and what they had wasn't enough. They kept the evidence, stored it carefully, documented everything. Because even though they couldn't solve the case now, they held on to hope that maybe someday, somehow, technology would catch up. That maybe someday, those samples they'd collected would finally be able to tell the story they couldn't tell in 1989. But for now, the case was going cold. Beverly's family felt it. The phone calls from detectives became less frequent. The updates became vaguer. "We're still working on it," turned into "we haven't forgotten," turned into long stretches of silence. They tried to hold on to hope, tried to believe that justice would come. But as the months dragged on, with no arrests, no charges, no answers, that hope started to feel more and more like denial. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Whoever killed Beverly Wivel was still out there, walking around, living their life, getting away with murder, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Not yet, anyway. By 1991, Beverly Wivel's case was officially cold. Not closed, cold. There's a difference. Closed means solved, wrapped up, justice served. Cold means the leads dried up, the tips stopped coming, the trail went dead. The file got moved to a back room somewhere, stacked among other unsolved cases gathering dust. But cold doesn't mean forgotten, at least not by everyone. For Beverly's family, the case never went cold. It burned every single day. a constant, aching presence that colored everything. Every birthday that passed without her, every holiday with an empty chair at the table, every milestone she should have been there for but wasn't. Her mother aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. The light went out of her eyes. The woman who used to smile easily, who used to fill rooms with warmth, became a shadow of herself. She went through the motions of living, but she wasn't really alive, not in any meaningful way. Part of her died the day Beverly did. She kept Beverly's room exactly as it was, couldn't bring herself to change anything. The clothes still hung in the closet, the pictures still sat on the dresser. It was like a shrine, a frozen moment in time. Walking into that room was like stepping into 1989 and never leaving. Every year on the anniversary of Beverly's death, her mother would sit in that room and cry. Just sit there surrounded by her daughter's things and let the grief wash over her all over again. It never got easier. People say time heals all wounds, but that's a lie. Time just teaches you how to live with the pain. It doesn't make it go away. Her father threw himself into finding answers. He became obsessed with the case in a way that worried the rest of the family. He kept his own files, his own notes. He'd call the police department regularly, asking for updates, pushing them not to give up. He'd follow up on rumors himself, chase down tips that probably led nowhere, refuse to accept that his daughter's killer might never be caught. He made it his mission, his purpose, because what else could he do? Sit back and accept that the person who murdered his little girl was out there living free? No, he couldn't do that, wouldn't do that. But as the years went by, even his determination started to crack under the weight of disappointment. The 90s came and went. Then, the 2000s. Beverly's siblings grew older, got married, had kids of their own, kids who would never know their aunt, kids who only heard stories about the woman Beverly had been. The family tried to move forward, tried to build lives, but Beverly's absence was always there, a hole that couldn't be filled. And through it all, her parents waited. Waited for a phone call that never came, waited for a knock on the door with news of an arrest, waited for justice that seemed more impossible with each passing year. Her mother died first, late 2000s. Heart gave out, the doctors said, but her family knew the truth. She died of a broken heart, died without ever knowing who killed her daughter, died without ever getting the closure she desperately needed. Her father followed a few years later. He'd held on longer, kept fighting longer, but in the end, he went to his grave with the same unanswered questions, the same burning need for justice that would never be satisfied. It was a tragedy on top of a tragedy. Not only had they lost their daughter, but they'd spent the rest of their lives tormented by not knowing, by the injustice of it all, by the fact that somewhere out there, Beverly's killer was still breathing while she wasn't. At the police department, the case sat in storage. Boxes of evidence, files full of interviews and reports and dead-end leads. It took up space in a room full of other cold cases, other unsolved mysteries, other families still waiting for answers. Most detectives moved on. That's not a criticism, it's just reality. New cases come in. Active investigations demand attention. You can't spend all your time on a case that's gone nowhere for years. You have to focus on the ones you might actually be able to solve. But there was one detective who never forgot Beverly Wivel. He'd been young when the case first came across his desk. Not the lead investigator, but part of the team. He'd interviewed witnesses, helped process evidence, sat with Beverly's family, and promised them he'd do everything he could to find who did this. And even though the case went cold, even though years passed, and he moved up the ranks and worked hundreds of other cases, Beverly stayed with him. Her face, her story, the promise he'd made to her family. Every few years, he'd pull the file, go through it again, see if there was something they'd missed, some angle they hadn't considered, some new technology that might help. But for the longest time, there was nothing. Just the same evidence that hadn't been enough in 1989, just the same frustrating lack of answers. There were moments, brief, painful moments, when hope flickered back to life. The mid-2000s brought a wave of cold case breakthroughs. DNA technology was advancing. Cases that had been unsolved for decades were suddenly getting cracked. Families who'd given up hope were finally getting justice. Beverly's family watched the news with a mixture of hope and envy. They were happy for those families, genuinely happy. But they also wondered, when would it be their turn? When would Beverly's case be the one that got solved? They'd reach out to the police department, ask if the new technology could be applied to Beverly's case, and the answer was always some variation of, "We're looking into it," or "We'll let you know if anything develops." But nothing ever developed. Each time a similar case got solved, the hope would surge, and each time Beverly's case remained unsolved, the disappointment cut deeper. It was psychological torture, not just for the family, but for the entire community. Because here's what people don't talk about enough. Unsolved murders don't just affect the victim's family, they affect everyone. They leave a scar on the whole community. Washington County never fully recovered from Beverly's murder. Oh, life went on. People moved in and out. New generations grew up who'd never heard of Beverly Wivel. The town changed and evolved, like all towns do. But for those who remembered, for those who'd been there in 1989, the case was always lurking in the back of their minds, a reminder that evil had touched their town and gotten away with it. A reminder that safety is an illusion. That bad things can happen anywhere, to anyone. Some people moved away because of it. Couldn't stand living in a place where a murderer might still be walking around. Couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of not knowing who to trust. Others stayed but changed, became more cautious, more suspicious. The easy trust that had defined small-town life evaporated. People locked their doors, watched their kids more closely, looked at neighbors with a little more wariness. And every few years, when someone would bring up Beverly's case at a town meeting, or in a local newspaper retrospective, or just in conversation, all those old feelings would come rushing back. The fear, the anger, the frustration. Why hadn't it been solved? How could someone get away with murder for this long? What did it say about justice that a young woman could be killed and her killer never caught? There were no good answers to those questions. As the 2010 seconds rolled around, Beverly's case was more than 20 years old. A whole generation had grown up since her death. To them, if they knew about it at all, it was ancient history, a sad story from before they were born. But to Beverly's siblings, to her extended family, to the few detectives who still remembered, it was as fresh as ever. The pain didn't diminish with time. If anything, it got worse. Because every year that passed was another year without justice, another year that Beverly's killer got to live free. Her siblings kept her memory alive as best they could, talked about her with their kids, made sure the next generation knew who Beverly was, what she meant to them, what had been stolen from her. But it was hard. How do you keep someone's memory alive when the world seems determined to forget, when there are no new developments to talk about, when the case just sits there, cold and unsolved, year after year after year? The evidence sat in storage, waiting. The DNA samples collected in 1989 were still there, carefully preserved, just in case. Just in case technology advanced enough. Just in case someone decided to take another look. Just in case a miracle happened. But miracles seemed in short supply. By 2015, Beverly had been gone for 26 years. Her parents were both dead. The detective who'd never forgotten her was nearing retirement. The community had largely moved on, and the case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Beverly Wivel was becoming a footnote, a cold case statistic, a name in a file that no one looked at anymore. Her family tried to accept it, tried to make peace with the fact that they might never know who killed her, that justice might never come. But acceptance doesn't mean peace. It just means you stop expecting things to change. And for the longest time, it seemed like nothing would. The case was cold, the trail was dead, the killer had won, or so everyone thought, because what no one knew, what no one could have predicted, was that the evidence sitting in that storage room was about to become incredibly valuable. That technology was advancing in ways that would revolutionize cold case investigations, that the DNA samples collected in 1989 were about to tell a story they couldn't tell back then, that after more than 3 decades of silence, Beverly Wivel's case was about to roar back to life. But that wouldn't happen for a few more years. For now, in the 2010 seconds, the case remained cold, the family remained in limbo, and Beverly's killer remained free. Thinking they'd gotten away with it, thinking they were safe, they had no idea what was coming. While Beverly's case sat cold for decades, something remarkable was happening in the world of forensic science, something that would eventually change everything. DNA technology had existed since the late 1000s, 980 seconds, but it was primitive, limited, expensive. Back when Beverly was murdered, investigators could collect DNA samples, but they couldn't do much with them unless they already had a suspect to compare them against. There was no database, no way to search for matches. The technology was there, but the infrastructure wasn't. That started to change in the 1,990 seconds. The FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in 1998. For the first time, law enforcement agencies across the country could upload DNA profiles from crime scenes and convicted offenders into a national database. If your DNA was in the system and it matched evidence from a crime scene, investigators would get a hit. It was revolutionary. Cold cases that had been unsolvable suddenly had new life. Rapists and murderers who thought they'd gotten away with their crimes were being identified and arrested years, sometimes decades, after the fact. But there was a catch. CODIS only worked if the perpetrator's DNA was already in the system. If they'd never been arrested, never been convicted of a crime that required a DNA sample, they wouldn't be in the database. And that meant their DNA sitting at a crime scene was useless for identification purposes. For years, that's where things stood. DNA technology got better, more accurate, faster, able to work with smaller samples, but it still required a match in the database. Then came the 2010 seconds, and everything changed again. Genetic genealogy burst onto the scene in a way no one saw coming. It started innocently enough. Consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe and Ancestry became wildly popular. People were sending in their saliva, getting their DNA analyzed, learning about their ethnic backgrounds, and finding long-lost relatives. Millions of people uploaded their DNA profiles to public genealogy databases. They were building family trees, connecting with cousins they didn't know existed. It was fun, harmless, but some very smart people realized something. If you could use DNA to find someone's relatives, you could use it to find criminals. The breakthrough case that proved it could work was the Golden State Killer. For decades, a serial rapist and murderer had terrorized California in the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds. He'd committed at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. Then he vanished. The case went cold. Investigators had his DNA from crime scenes, but it didn't match anyone in CODIS. In 2018, investigators tried something new. They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. They got hits, not exact matches, but distant relatives. From there, they built family trees, narrowed down possibilities, identified a suspect, Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer living quietly in suburban Sacramento. He was 72 years old when they arrested him. The news sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the true crime community. If genetic genealogy could catch the Golden State Killer after 40 years, what other cold cases could it solve? Turns out, a lot of them. Case after case started getting cracked. Murders from the 1,970 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds cases that had been cold for decades were suddenly being solved. Families who'd given up hope were finally getting answers. Killers who thought they were safe were being arrested. The 1,987 murder of a young couple in Washington state, solved in 2018 using genetic genealogy. The 1,993 murder of a woman in Pennsylvania, solved in 2019. The 1,995 murder of a teacher in Texas, solved in 2020. The list kept growing. It was like a dam had broken. Cold case units across the country started revisiting old evidence, looking for DNA samples that could be run through genealogy databases. And here's the beautiful part: evidence that had been sitting in storage for 30, 40, even 50 years was suddenly incredibly valuable. DNA samples that couldn't tell investigators anything in the 1,980 seconds or 90 seconds could now identify a killer's entire family tree. Old evidence became new hope. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What's the weather like where you are today? Seriously, drop it in the comments. Sunny? Rainy? Snowing? I'm curious. And while you're down there, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and smashed the like. We're about to get to the part where Beverly's case finally breaks wide open, and you're not going to want to miss it. By the early 2022s, genetic genealogy had become a standard tool in cold case investigations. Police departments that had the budget and the resources were pulling old cases off the shelves and taking another look. Washington County was one of them. The decision to revisit cold cases didn't happen overnight. It required funding, it required personnel, it required a commitment from leadership that these cases mattered, even if they were decades old. But the success stories from other jurisdictions were impossible to ignore. Families were getting closure, killers were being brought to justice, and all it took was preserved evidence and new technology. Washington County's cold case unit started going through their files, looking at unsolved murders and sexual assaults from the 1982nd and 92nd, identifying cases where DNA evidence had been collected and preserved. Beverly Wivel's case was near the top of the list. The detective who'd never forgotten her had retired by then, but he'd made sure the case was flagged, made sure the new generation of investigators knew about Beverly, knew that her family deserved answers, knew that somewhere in those boxes of evidence might be the key to finally solving her murder. In the early 2022s, Beverly's case was pulled from storage. The evidence was re-examined. The DNA samples collected in 1989 samples that had been sitting untouched for over 30 years were sent to a lab for modern analysis. The technology had advanced so much that they could extract a full DNA profile from evidence that would have been considered too degraded or too small to work with back in 1989. They ran the profile through CODIS first, standard procedure, but just like investigators had expected, there was no hit. Whoever killed Beverly wasn't in the criminal DNA database, so they took the next step. They uploaded the profile to genealogy databases, and they waited. What came back changed everything. They got hits, not exact matches. The killer himself hadn't uploaded his DNA to a genealogy site, but his relatives had. Distant cousins, third and fourth cousins who had no idea they were related to a murderer. From there, forensic genealogists went to work. They built family trees, traced lineages, narrowed down branches, identified potential suspects who would have been the right age, in the right location, at the right time. It was painstaking work. It took months, but slowly, surely, they closed in on a name. A man in his 60s, living not far from where Beverly had been killed. He'd been in the area in 1989. He fit the profile. Investigators started surveillance, watched him, waited for an opportunity to get a direct DNA sample to confirm the match. When they finally got it, a discarded coffee cup, a cigarette butt, something he'd touched and thrown away, they tested it against the DNA from Beverly's case. It was a match. After 36 years, they had him. Beverly Wivel's killer finally had a name. The call came in early 2023. A cold case detective in Washington County pulled Beverly Wivel's file from storage and knew immediately this was one they needed to prioritize. The case had been cold for 34 years. Her parents were gone, but her siblings were still alive, still waiting, still hoping that somehow, someday, they'd get answers. The detective assembled a team, cold case investigators, forensic specialists, a genetic genealogist who'd worked on similar cases across the country. They were going to give Beverly's case everything they had, every resource, every advancement in technology that hadn't existed in 1989. The first step was retrieving the physical evidence, boxes that had been sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility for over 3 decades. Everything had been carefully preserved. Clothing, swabs, samples collected from the crime scene and from Beverly's body. Back in 1989, investigators had done their job well. They'd collected everything they could, even knowing the technology of the time couldn't do much with it. Now, that foresight was about to pay off. The evidence was transported to a state-of-the-art forensic lab, the kind of facility that didn't exist in the 80s, the kind of place where scientists could work with microscopic amounts of DNA and still build a complete profile. The forensic team started with the biological samples, swabs taken from Beverly's body, trace evidence collected from her clothing, material that had been tested back in 1989 but had yielded limited results with the primitive technology available at the time. Now, they were starting fresh. The process of extracting DNA from decades-old evidence is delicate, painstaking. You can't rush it. The samples had been preserved well, but they'd still degraded over time. The DNA was fragmented, broken into pieces. Not the clean, complete profiles you'd get from fresh evidence. But modern technology could work with that. Scientists used advanced extraction techniques, amplified the DNA, pieced together fragments like a puzzle. It took weeks, multiple attempts, careful calibration of equipment and methods. But slowly, a profile began to emerge. A male DNA profile, not Beverly's, not anyone who had a legitimate reason to be in contact with her. This was foreign DNA. DNA that had been left behind by someone who'd had close, violent contact with her. The forensic team ran quality checks, made sure the profile was solid, made sure it was complete enough to be useful for comparison. And when they were confident they had something viable, they moved to the next step. CODIS, the National DNA Database. It was standard procedure. Run the profile through the system and see if there's a match with a known offender. The search came back negative. Whoever this DNA belonged to had never been arrested for a crime that required a DNA sample, had never been entered into the criminal database. In the old days, that would have been the end of the road, a dead end, another frustrating brick wall. But this wasn't the old days. The team had a genetic genealogist on standby, a specialist who'd helped solve dozens of cold cases using public genealogy databases, someone who understood how to take a DNA profile and trace it through family trees to identify potential suspects. They uploaded the profile to GE Deadmatch and Family Tree DNA, public databases where people had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to find relatives and trace their ancestry. Databases that contained millions of profiles, and then they waited. The results came back within days. Not an exact match, the killer himself hadn't uploaded his DNA, but they got hits, multiple hits, distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared segments of DNA with the unknown male profile from Beverly's case. This was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. The genetic genealogist went to work. She started building family trees, took the matches from the database and traced their lineages backward, found common ancestors, identified family branches that could have led to the person whose DNA was found on Beverly. It was like working backward through time, taking fragments of information, birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, census data, and constructing a map of how families connected across generations. She worked for weeks, mapping out trees, eliminating branches that didn't fit, narrowing down possibilities based on geography and age. The killer would have been in Washington County, Michigan, in 1989. Would have been old enough to commit the crime, probably late teens to 40s. At the time, some branches of the family tree were ruled out immediately. People who'd lived in other states, people who died before 1989, people who were too young or too old. Other branches required deeper investigation. The genealogist worked with the detective team, cross-referencing names with public records, driver's licenses, property records, employment history. Anything that could place someone in the right location at the right time. Slowly, the pool of potential suspects narrowed, from hundreds of distant relatives down to dozens of possible family branches, then down to a handful of individuals who fit the profile, and then, finally, down to one name, a man in his early 60s, living in Michigan, not far from Washington County. He'd been in his mid-20s in 1989, the right age, the right location, no criminal record which explained why his DNA wasn't in CODIS. The detective team pulled everything they could find on him, public records, social media, employment history. They built a profile of his life, where he'd lived, where he'd worked, who he'd associated with, and the more they dug, the more everything lined up. He'd been living in the area in 1989, had connections to places Beverly had frequented. There was nothing that definitively placed him with Beverly that night, no witnesses, no paper trail, but the circumstantial evidence was stacking up. Still, they needed confirmation. The genealogy work had pointed them in the right direction, but it wasn't enough for an arrest. They needed a direct DNA match. They needed his DNA compared against the profile from Beverly's case. That meant surveillance. Detectives started watching him, discreetly, following his movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. It's called abandoned DNA, and it's perfectly legal. If someone throws away a coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a napkin, anything they've touched that contains their saliva or skin cells, Law enforcement can collect it and test it. They followed him for days, watched him go to work, run errands, live his normal, quiet life, a life he'd been living for 36 years while Beverly's family suffered, while her parents died without answers, while her siblings grew old wondering if justice would ever come. He had no idea he was being watched, no idea that decades-old evidence had finally caught up with him, no idea that the DNA he'd left behind in 1989 was about to destroy the life he'd built. Then, one morning, he stopped at a coffee shop, ordered a drink, sat outside for a few minutes, and when he left, he tossed the cup in a trash can. Detectives moved in the moment he was gone, carefully retrieved the cup, bagged it as evidence, sent it straight to the lab. The DNA was extracted, processed, compared against the profile from Beverly's case. The call came back within days. It was a match, not a partial match, not a close match, a definitive, no doubt about it match. The DNA on that coffee cup belonged to the same person whose DNA had been found on Beverly Wivel's body in 1989. After 36 years, they had him. The detective who'd been leading the reinvestigation sat in his office staring at the report. This was it. This was the moment they'd been working toward. The moment Beverly's family had been waiting for since 1989. He picked up the phone, called the prosecutor's office, walked them through the evidence, the genealogy work, the surveillance, the DNA match, everything they'd need to build a case. The prosecutor agreed. They had enough, more than enough. It was time to make an arrest. The team started planning the operation. They'd move quickly, quietly. They didn't want to give him any chance to run, any chance to destroy evidence, any chance to slip away. They coordinated with local law enforcement, set a date, assigned roles, made sure everyone knew the plan, and then, on a cold February morning in 2025, they moved. Unmarked cars rolled up to his house. Detectives approached the door, knocked, identified themselves. When he answered, they placed him under arrest for the 1989 murder of Beverly Wivel. He didn't resist, didn't run, just stood there, stunned, as they read him his rights and placed handcuffs on his wrists. For 36 years, he'd lived free. For 36 years, he'd thought he'd gotten away with it. But DNA doesn't forget, science doesn't give up, and justice, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding the truth. Beverly Wivel's case was cold no more. February 2025. The morning was cold and grey, the kind of morning where your breath fogs in the air and frost clings to car windshields. Most people were just starting their day, pouring coffee, getting ready for work, going through the motions of ordinary life. But for the detectives assembled in an unmarked van 3 blocks away from a quiet residential street, this was anything but ordinary. This was the day they'd arrest Beverly Wivel's killer. The operation had been planned down to the minute. They'd surveilled the house for days, knew his routine, knew he usually left for work around 7:30 in the morning. They'd move before that. Catch him at home. Minimize the risk of a chase or a confrontation in public. The team consisted of cold case detectives, uniformed officers as backup, and a prosecutor who'd been briefed on every detail of the case. They had an arrest warrant. They had evidence. They had everything they needed. At 6:45 a.m., they moved. 3 unmarked cars pulled up to the house. Detectives stepped out, moving quickly but calmly. They'd done this before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just another arrest. This was justice 36 years in the making. They approached the front door, knocked, firm, authoritative. Police opened the door. There was movement inside, footsteps, a pause, then the door opened. He stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, a man in his early 60s, graying hair, ordinary face, the kind of person you'd pass on the street and never look twice at. Nothing about him screamed, murderer. Nothing about him suggested he was capable of the violence he'd inflicted on Beverly Wivel. But that's the thing about killers. They don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like everyone else. "Are you suspect's name?" the lead detective asked. "Yes. What's this about?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Beverly Wivel." For a split second, his face went blank, like his brain was trying to process words that didn't make sense. Then something flickered in his eyes. Fear, panic, the realization that the past had finally caught up with him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice wavered. "Turn around, hands behind your back." He didn't resist, didn't run, just stood there as they cuffed him, read him his rights, walked him to the car while neighbors started peeking out windows, trying to figure out what was happening. As they put him in the back of the unmarked vehicle, one of the detectives looked at him through the rear-view mirror. 36 years, the detective said quietly. "You thought you got away with it." The suspect said nothing, just stared straight ahead. So who was this man? Who was the person who'd murdered Beverly Wivel and then lived a normal life for more than 3 decades? His name hasn't been fully released to protect the integrity of the ongoing case, but here's what we know. He was in his mid-20s in 1989, lived in the area, had no significant criminal record, a few minor infractions over the years, nothing that required a DNA sample, nothing that would have flagged him to investigators. He'd held down jobs, paid his taxes, maybe had relationships, maybe got married, maybe had kids who had no idea what their father had done. He'd lived in Michigan his whole life, never moved far from Washington County, never tried to run or hide. Maybe he thought enough time had passed. Maybe he thought the case was so cold it would never be solved. Maybe he'd convinced himself he was safe. For 36 years, he'd gone to bed every night knowing what he'd done, knowing he'd taken a young woman's life, knowing he'd destroyed a family, and he'd done nothing, said nothing, just kept living while Beverly stayed dead. That's a special kind of evil, not the loud, obvious kind, the quiet kind, the kind that blends in, the kind that shakes your hand and smiles and makes you think they're just like everyone else. At the station, he was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, placed in an interrogation room. Detectives laid out the evidence, told him about the DNA, about the genetic genealogy, about the coffee cup, about how science had connected him to a murder he committed in 1989. He didn't say much, asked for a lawyer almost immediately. That was his right. But his silence spoke volumes. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA match was ironclad. His DNA collected from that discarded coffee cup was a definitive match to the DNA found on Beverly's body 36 years ago. The kind of match that doesn't leave room for doubt. The kind of match that holds up in court. Beyond the DNA, investigators had built a circumstantial case, placed him in the area at the time of the murder, established that he had no alibi for the night Beverly disappeared, found inconsistencies in statements he'd given back in 1989 when he'd been interviewed as part of the initial canvassing of the area. Back then, he'd been just another name in a long list of people detectives talked to. Nothing had stood out. Nothing had raised red flags. He'd answered their questions, and they'd moved on. But now, looking back at those old interviews with fresh eyes and new evidence, things didn't add up. Small details, minor contradictions, the kind of things that mean nothing on their own but take on new significance when you know someone's guilty. The prosecutor's office moved quickly. Within 48 hours of his arrest, formal charges were filed. Murder in the first degree, premeditated, intentional, the kind of charge that carries a life sentence. And then the news broke. The media explosion was immediate. Local news stations ran breaking news alerts. National outlets picked up the story. Cold case solved after 36 years. DNA technology catches 1,989. Killer. Justice for Beverly Wivel. Her face was on every screen again. The same photos from 1,989. Young, smiling, full of life. Next to those photos, they showed the suspect. Older now, worn down, being led into court in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The contrast was stark. Beverly, frozen in time at 23. Him, aged by 36 years of freedom she never got. The public reaction was intense. Social media exploded with comments. People who remembered the case from 1,989 were stunned. People who'd never heard of Beverly Wivel were outraged. How does someone get away with murder for 36 years? How does someone live a normal life knowing what they've done? In Washington County, the news hit like a shockwave. People who'd lived through the original investigation, who'd searched for Beverly, who'd mourned her death, they were relieved, vindicated. Finally, after all these years, someone was being held accountable. But there was anger too. Anger that it took so long. Anger that Beverly's parents never got to see this day. anger that this man had walked free for decades while a family suffered. Beverly's siblings released a statement through their attorney. It was brief, emotional. "We are grateful to the investigators who never gave up on Beverly's case. We are heartbroken that our parents did not live to see this day. But we are relieved that the person responsible for our sister's death is finally being held accountable. Beverly deserved justice, and after 36 years, she's finally getting it." The suspect, meanwhile, remained silent. His lawyer issued a standard statement. "My client maintains his innocence and looks forward to his day in court." But maintaining innocence in the face of DNA evidence is a tough sell. His legal team knew it. The prosecutor knew it. Everyone knew it. Still, he had the right to a trial, the right to present a defense, the right to make the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the state was ready. They had the DNA, they had the genealogy work, they had the timeline, they had everything they needed to put him away for the rest of his life. As he sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, did he think about Beverly? Did he think about what he'd done to her? Did he feel remorse, guilt, or did he just feel sorry for himself that he'd finally been caught? No one knows. He wasn't talking, but it didn't matter. The evidence would speak for him. The DNA would tell the story he refused to tell. And Beverly Wivel, silent for 36 years, would finally have her voice heard in a courtroom. Justice was coming. Slow, delayed, but coming nonetheless. When Beverly's siblings got the call that an arrest had been made, they didn't know how to feel. Relief, grief, anger, gratitude, it all hit at once. A tidal wave of emotions that had been building for 36 years, finally crashing down. They'd waited so long for this moment, prayed for it, dreamed about it. But they'd also stopped believing it would ever actually happen. After decades of disappointment, of dead ends, of watching other families get closure while theirs remained in limbo, they'd started to accept that Beverly's case might never be solved. And now, suddenly, it was. Her brother spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, voice shaking but steady. "We never gave up hope, even when it seemed impossible, even when everyone told us the case was too old, too cold. We never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would come out." Her sister was less composed. She broke down during her statement, tears streaming down her face. "I just wish our parents were here to see this. They died not knowing. They died carrying that pain. And that's something we'll never get back." That was the bittersweet reality of this victory. Yes, Beverly's killer had been caught. Yes, justice was finally being served. But it came too late for the people who needed it most. Her mother and father had spent the last years of their lives tormented by unanswered questions. They'd gone to their graves not knowing who murdered their daughter, not knowing if that person would ever be held accountable, not knowing if Beverly's death would ever mean anything beyond senseless tragedy. And now, years after they'd passed, the answers finally came. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it was the reality of cold cases. Justice delayed is still justice, but it doesn't erase the years of suffering that came before it. Still, Beverly's siblings were grateful. Grateful to the detectives who'd never given up. Grateful to the forensic scientists who'd worked with decades-old evidence. Grateful to the genetic genealogist who'd traced family trees and identified a killer. Grateful that their sister's case hadn't been forgotten. Beverly mattered, her brother said. Her life mattered, and now the world knows that. Now everyone knows that you can't just take someone's life and walk away. Eventually, the truth catches up. In Washington County, the arrest brought a sense of closure the community hadn't felt in decades. People who'd lived through the original investigation, who'd searched for Beverly, who'd attended her funeral, they felt vindicated. The case that had haunted their town for 36 years was finally solved. Local churches held services of remembrance, not just for Beverly, but for all the years of uncertainty and fear that had gripped the community. It was a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been building since 1989. People talked about feeling safe again, about no longer wondering if Beverly's killer was someone they knew, someone they'd passed on the street, someone sitting next to them at the grocery store. The monster had a name now, a face, and he was behind bars where he belonged. But the impact of this case reached far beyond Washington County, far beyond Beverly's family, because this case proved something crucial, something that every family with an unsolved murder needs to hear. There is no statute of limitations on murder. Time doesn't erase accountability. 36 years, 40 years, 50 years, it doesn't matter. If you take someone's life, justice can still find you. And with modern DNA technology and genetic genealogy, cold cases that seemed unsolvable are being cracked every single day. The Golden State Killer, caught after 40 years. The killer of Christy Mirak in Pennsylvania, caught after 25 years. The murderer of April Tinsley in Indiana, caught after 30 years. The list goes on, and Beverly Wivel's case just added another name to it. For families still waiting for answers, families with loved ones whose cases have gone cold, Beverly's story is a beacon of hope. It's proof that even when it seems impossible, even when decades have passed, breakthroughs can still happen. Evidence that seemed useless in the 80s and 90s is now solving cases. DNA that couldn't identify anyone back then is now pointing directly at killers. Technology is reaching back through time and delivering justice that once seemed out of reach. And that means no one is safe. No killer can rest easy thinking they've gotten away with it, because the evidence is still there, waiting, and science is only getting better. Beverly's case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence. Back in 1989, investigators collected samples, even though they couldn't do much with them at the time. They documented everything, stored everything properly, and 36 years later, that diligence paid off. It's a lesson for law enforcement everywhere. Preserve the evidence, document everything, because you never know when technology will advance enough to make the unsolvable solvable. Before we wrap this up, I need you to do something for me. If this story moved you, if Beverly's case reminded you why justice matters, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you think about this case, because stories like Beverly's need to be told, victims need to be remembered, and families need to know that people care. Share this video with someone who loves true crime, someone who believes in justice, someone who needs to hear that cold cases can still be solved. The more people who know Beverly's story, the more pressure there is to keep working on other cold cases, to keep pushing for answers, to keep fighting for victims who can't fight for themselves. Beverly Wivel was 23 years old when her life was stolen. She had dreams, plans, a future that should have stretched out for decades. She should have gotten married, had kids, grown old, experienced all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make up a life. Instead, she got 36 years of silence, 36 years of being a cold case file, a name on a list of unsolved murders. But she also got something else. She got people who refused to forget her, detectives who kept her case alive even when it seemed hopeless, scientists who used cutting-edge technology to find answers, a family who never stopped fighting for justice. And in the end, she got the truth. Her killer didn't get away with it. He thought he had. For 36 years, he probably slept soundly, convinced he was safe, convinced the past was buried. But the past doesn't stay buried, not when there are people determined to dig it up. Beverly's legacy isn't just her death, it's the persistence of those who loved her. It's the advancement of science that made justice possible. It's the reminder that no matter how much time passes, truth has a way of surfacing. Her case is a testament to the fact that some fights are worth fighting, even when they take decades, that some promises are worth keeping, even when they seem impossible, that some voices deserve to be heard, even when they've been silent for far too long. Beverly Wivel mattered, her life mattered, her death mattered, and her justice delayed as it was mattered. And now, 36 years later, the world finally knows her story, not just as a victim, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who deserved so much more than she got. Rest in peace, Beverly. Your voice has finally been heard. Time doesn't erase accountability. That's the lesson here. That's what Beverly Wivel's case teaches us. You can run, you can hide, you can live a normal life for decades, thinking you've escaped the consequences of your actions. But DNA doesn't forget, science doesn't give up. And the people who love the victims you left behind, they never stop fighting. 36 years is a long time, long enough for technology to evolve, long enough for parents to die without answers, long enough for a killer to think they're safe. But it wasn't long enough to erase the truth. Beverly's case reminds us of the human cost of violence. It's not just the victim who suffers. It's the parents who spend the rest of their lives in agony. The siblings who grow old with a hole in their family that can never be filled. The community that loses its sense of safety. The friends who carry guilt for not being there, even though there was nothing they could have done. Murder doesn't just take one life. It shatters dozens, hundreds. It ripples outward, touching everyone connected to the victim, leaving scars that never fully heal. But Beverly's case also reminds us of something else. The endurance of love, the refusal to give up, the determination to keep fighting even when the odds seem impossible. Her family never stopped loving her, never stopped demanding justice, never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out. And they were right. So if you're watching this and you have a loved one whose case is still unsolved, don't give up. Keep pushing, keep demanding answers, keep their name alive. Because cases that seem hopeless today might be solvable tomorrow. Technology is advancing, methods are improving, and cold case units across the country are revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes. Your loved one's case could be next. To everyone who stuck with me through this entire story, thank you. Seriously, thank you for caring about Beverly. Thank you for listening to her story. Thank you for being part of a community that believes victims deserve justice, no matter how long it takes. If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought about Beverly's story. And share this video. Share it with your friends, your family, anyone who cares about true crime and justice. We've got more cases coming, more stories that need to be told, more victims who deserve to be remembered. Next time, we're diving into another case that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Another story of persistence, justice, and the refusal to let killers hide in the shadows. Until then, stay safe out there. Lock your doors, trust your instincts, and remember the truth always finds a way. This is Easy Case. And Beverly Wivel's story? It's proof that justice delayed is not justice denied. See you in the next one.